Well, greetings, everybody. This is Dr. Ronald Brown, your favorite speaker. And our topic for today is the Lubavitchers and the world of Hasidic Jews. Fascinating chapter in history of world religions, and especially in the history of Judaism. So this is our outline for today. The influence of the diaspora on Jewish religion. Extremely important challenge that could have ended in the disappearance of Jews from history. Well, as the Jews spread around the world, there was the danger of assimilation. Handful of Jews in Spain or Morocco or Iraq or India or Britain or Holland could have easily just disappeared into the mass of human population, and Judaism could again have disappeared. Well, then the background, the migration of a good number of Jews to Eastern Europe, the emergence of Talmudic Judaism, specific form of Judaism, the Hasidic revolution. Where did the Hasidic Jews come from? What were they revolting against? And then the rise of a particular Hasidic group called the Lubavitchers. And then, point 7, Hasidic Jews today. So, fascinating chapter in world religions, fascinating chapter in Jewish history, and a fascinating chapter in human religious identity. So let's get started on discovering the Lubavitchers. Well, as in every religion, it is a question of adapting to new challenges, new circumstances, or simply dying. When we talk about world religions, of course, we often wonder whatever happened to all those Greek and Roman and Aztec and Inca gods that were worshipped by millions of people. Gods of Egypt, the gods of Babylon have disappeared for the reason that they were unable to adapt. Some religions have adapted to new circumstances and managed to survive. This would be the Protestant Reformation, especially in Northern Europe, a rising, educated middle class, and religion had to adapt, or Christianity could have died out in Northern Europe, but the Protestant Reformation produced a plethora of religious groups. So religions, if they don't adapt, they die out. And if they do adapt, they can have a new burst of energy. Well, when we look at religion from the point of view of today, are there going to be Jews in 1,000 years? Are there going to be Christians? Are people going to say the Prophet Muhammad, who was that? Or the Buddha? I read about him in some obscure text. Well, unfortunately, we don't know what will happen in the future. Well, the Hasidic Jews are a group of Jews who were able to take traditional Judaism, change it, whip it into shape, adapt it, junk certain aspects, adapt other aspects, invent new ways of survival. So when we go in Brooklyn or the other Hasidic Jewish neighborhoods, and we see the funny wool hats and the funny curls and the women with their headscarves and these little kids going around with long curls and funny prayer shawls. They look very strange, but here again, this is an adaptation which has enabled many Jews to survive and continue to not only survive, but thrive and grow in the modern world. So, what happened? Well, Abraham, the founder of Judaism, was born in Babylon, grew up in a religious Babylonian idol-worshiping family, had a religious experience, and decided to leave Ur, his homeland, and migrated down into the land of Canaan, and then eventually into Egypt. So the early Jews were a nomadic people with their camels, their sheep, and their goats roaming around the Middle East. Well, we can't understand Judaism without understanding its roots in Babylon. These great stories that we learn from the Jewish Bible, Adam and Eve, the Garden of Eden, Noah and his ark. All of these stories are not Jewish at all, but they were borrowed from the ancient legends of the Babylonians. So Abraham was an heir of Babylon and accepted these stories, and gradually these ancient Babylonian stories were incorporated into the Jewish Bible. Book of Genesis, the stories of creation were all borrowed from the Babylonians and transformed, reinterpreted, and became part of the Jewish religion, were later on accepted and adapted and modified by the Christians, and later on adapted and modified and reinterpreted by the Muslims, and a process which continues until today. Well, the story of Moses, the Jews ended up in Egypt. The beginning, they were welcomed as labor force. Their men entered the Egyptian army. They were very strong supporters of the pharaohs and of the kings, keeping the local Egyptians in power. Well, eventually they just got too much power and thought of even taking over Egypt. And in a great struggle between the invading Hebrew people and the pharaohs won, and the Jews were reduced to the status of slaves. Well, they endured slavery until Moses came along and rallied the people, became their leader. And we know again the Bible story of the Exodus from Egypt through the Sinai, 40 years wandering in the desert, and then their eventual conquest of the land of Canaan. Well, during these periods of wandering in the desert, the Jews evolved certain laws. Most famous are the Ten Commandments. They developed certain holidays, such as Passover, certain rituals, such as circumcision, and certain traditions, such as not eating pork. And gradually, a new religion evolved in the deserts of the Sinai under the leadership of Moses, the struggle with idol worshipers and the worship of one God. Gradually, they entered the land of Canaan, which they claimed had been promised to Abraham, and set out like all conquering people, exterminating the Canaanites, enslaving them, forced conversion, and gradually they gained in power. and eventually developed a kingdom, first to King Saul, then King David, and King Solomon. And David conquered Jerusalem and exterminated the Jebusites who had built the city and transformed it into the capital of the new Jewish kingdom. Along came Solomon and built his temple, established a priesthood, and the 12 tribes of Israel were united into one powerful kingdom that under Solomon achieved the dream of the Jewish people from the Euphrates to the Nile. Well, Solomon reached the Euphrates and was even a threat to Babylon, pushed into the Sinai and was a threat to Egypt. Well, after Solomon, the kingdom fell apart, but it was still a threat to both the Egyptians in the south and the Babylonians in the north. So Babylon decided it was time to wipe out this usurper kingdom in the land of Canaan, conquered it, carried off the elite of the kingdom of Israel, and took them to Babylon. Well, the second temple, the first temple built by Solomon, was destroyed. Most of the priests were killed off, and the Jews in Babylon were basically left high and dry. How were they going to survive? Would they survive, or would they simply assimilate into the superior culture, marry Babylonians, and get a whole gang of kids who say, oh, yes, my mother was a Hebrew from the land of Israel. My father was a Babylonian, and I'm, as Woody Allen would have said, I'm in therapy. Well, the Jews eventually were able to return to the land of Canaan, the land of Israel. They built the second temple, and this was also destroyed because under King Herod, the Jews got too powerful. They challenged the domination of Rome, and Jerusalem was again destroyed. The temple was leveled. The priests were killed, and in 70 AD, the Jews scattered throughout the world. Some went to Egypt, some went to Babylon, others went to modern-day Turkey, others went to North Africa, Europe, Greece, and Rome itself. Well, this was a major challenge for the Jews at the time. Were they going to assimilate, and were they going to disappear into the garbage can of history? And I always tell my students that there are more religions in the garbage can of history than there are religions on the face of the earth today. Think of all the millions of people who worship the gods of the Romans, the gods of the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Greeks, the Celts, the Anglo-Saxons, the ancient Aztecs and Mayas, and most of the ancient religions of Africa and Asia. All disappeared. We don't even know the names of half of their gods, but yet these were religions worshipped by millions of people, but they disappeared. Were the Hebrews going to follow in the same path? A handful of Hebrews ending up in India could have easily disappeared. The handful that were in Iraq or Persia or Germany or France or North Africa or Egypt or Ethiopia could have all very easily disappeared. And it was not at all surprising that they would. Gradually, a handful of people would forget their ancient founding legends. of Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden and David and Solomon. Their heroes and prophets would be forgotten, just sort of legendary people, sort of like Santa Claus or the Tooth Fairy. They would start ignoring the law codes and start eating just like everybody else, dressing like everybody else. Passover would have been just sort of a tradition that some of the old people remembered but was fading away. They were not in the land of Israel, and that would have been sort of a distant memory, sort of like most Americans have a distant memory of their ancestors coming from Ireland or Germany or Russia or Italy, but vague memory. So they were not in a land. They did not have a capital city. They did not have the temple. They did not have the priesthood. And they could have very easily disappeared. Well, there's the ancient legend that 10 tribes actually did disappear, the so-called lost 10 tribes of Israel. Where did they go? Some people said they got lost in India or China. Some people say they disappeared into the jungles of Africa. Who knows what happened to all of these people? Well, if 10 tribes can disappear, well, then why not the entire 12 tribes? So how were they going to survive? Well, this was a major change in Judaism. The temple was gone. The priests were killed off. The language of Hebrew was disappearing. Well, songs from Isaiah would say, "Comfort, oh, comfort my people. Don't get lost. Don't assimilate. Don't disappear." But how were they going to survive? Well, what they did, temple was gone. Priests were mainly dead. They had no kings. Hebrew was a dead language. How were they going to adapt Judaism to the new circumstances? Well, it was in the diaspora, in the Exodus, that the Torah was written down, the first 5 books. The leaders agreed on a certain number of books and a certain text. Well, the priests and the temples were gone, so certain educated Jews declared themselves to be the religious leaders and came to be known as rabbis. And they would gather their followers together in their living room or in a rented hall, and there they would study the Torah and be instructed in Hebrew by the rabbis. And gradually we call these the synagogues. Certain rabbis started writing their own interpretations of the Torah, their own history. They continued to practice circumcision on boys. They adapted laws of kosher food. What was kosher? What could they eat? What couldn't they eat? They continued to celebrate Passover, which was a family holiday at home, so they didn't need a temple or even a synagogue for that. The Jews started adopting a distinctive way of dressing to show themselves and other people that they were different from the Babylonians, from the Persians, from the Indians, from the Germans or the French or the Romans or the Greeks or the Africans. And they started living together in what we call today ethnic neighborhoods. So just like today in New York, you have Little Italy, you have Chinatown, you have African-American Harlem, you have the Dominican people up in Washington Heights, you have the Hispanics in Jackson Heights, and you have African-Americans in Jamaica. Well, the Jews also started living in neighborhoods, and they adapted Temple Judaism, which didn't exist anymore, to synagogue Judaism. They realized that the priests were gone and not performing sacrifices of animals in temples, and so they replaced them with rabbis. And so new kind of Judaism was developed, one which was portable. You could basically take the Torah, put it in your pocket, go somewhere, have yourself declared a rabbi, found a synagogue, and continue a certain kind of Judaism. No longer the temple Judaism, but it was the synagogue Judaism. So the temple morphed into a synagogue. The priests were replaced by rabbis. Animal sacrifice in the temple was replaced by study of the book. Hebrew, which was a dead language, became known as a holy language. And they started developing teachings such as monotheism. As we see, there is only one God, and this is the God of the universe. So monotheism was one of these adaptations that the Jews did in the diaspora. Well, various kinds of Judaism emerged. You had the Sephardic Judaism, which was in Spain and Portugal and southern France. They developed their own language called Ladino, which was a mixture of Spanish, Portuguese, Latin, Hebrew, and Arabic, all mixed in together, but written with the Hebrew alphabet. The Jews of Germany and Eastern Europe developed another language called Yiddish. These are the Ashkenazi Jews. The Jews in India, Ethiopia, Morocco, Central Asia, famous Bukharian, the Jews of China and Persia all developed their own kind of Judaism. They intermarried with the local people. So the Jews of Ethiopia began to look like Africans. The Jews of Eastern Europe intermarried with Germans and Poles and Russians and became blonde hair and blue-eyed. The Jews of Persia intermarried with Persians and started to look like Persians. Each of these groups developed their own unique form of Judaism. The minhag, the customs, they had their own scholars and teachers, the various Jewish languages, the way of dressing, the way they built their synagogues, the food they ate, the music they sang, and their own pronunciation of the ancient dead language of Hebrew. And so you had many forms of Judaism which emerged, each adapted to a different area of the world. Who knows? Maybe Jews even ended up on Mars, where they intermarried with Martians, started looking like Martians, and developed their own language and their own culture of Judaism on Mars. Well, not all Jews remained loyal to Judaism. Just like the Jews of America and the Jews of France and Germany, many of them just assimilated and became Germans. They'd marry a German Jew would marry a German Christian, and the children would be sort of raised as nothing. They would marry Christians, and gradually a branch of Judaism would die out. Why stick to kosher food when, like in America, well, pepperoni pizza with a Budweiser sounds good. They started dressing like ordinary people. Many of the Jews even stopped circumcising their boys, saying, well, you know, in the Roman Empire, it looks weird when you go to the baths or to the gym and you're taking a shower. People look at you like you're weird. So it's not that important. Many of them just assimilated and started worshiping the gods of the Greeks, the gods of the Romans, the Persians, the Indians, the Ethiopians, the Egyptians, and they assimilated. Well, one group of Jews migrated to Eastern Europe. This is what we call today Germany to an extent, but especially Poland, Hungary, Romania, Ukraine, Russia, and Lithuania. Map on the left shows the migration beginning in the year 1000s, 1200s, 1400s. These are the European Middle Ages. Large number of Jews migrated to these new countries which were emerging, such as Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, Russia, Ukraine, Romania, and Hungary. And they settled in what became known as the Pale. The map on the right, you see the areas of Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, parts of Russia, Hungary, and this became a major concentration of Jews. So why did the Jews go to, see the map on the right, the Kingdom of Poland, the Kingdom of Hungary, Pomerania, Prussia, Lithuania, Russia? Why did the Jews go there? Well, these people were largely barbarians. And so they wanted people to come to establish their country. So if you were the king of Lithuania or Russia, you wanted doctors and lawyers and engineers and generals and architects and teachers and doctors to come migrate to your country and civilize your people. Well, of course, they were inviting priests and bishops from the Byzantine Empire and from Rome to teach these people Christianity, but they were still barbarians. And so they said, well, if you are a Jew and you are a doctor, well, you can work here. We'll set up a hospital for you. If you were an accountant or a businessman, you could open up businesses. So various kings, such as King Mieszko I of Poland, invited Jews to come into Poland and begin to civilize his country. Well, Poland gradually started getting organized and had large numbers of Jewish generals, professors, doctors, and lawyers who were loyal to the king, even though the king was Catholic by the 1000 and by the 1500s. Still, Jews were very important. They controlled business. They were very important in the government, in administration. They were professors at the university. Poland became very powerful. See the map on the right, the great Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth of the 1500s to the late 1700s, a great Polish-Lithuanian empire. And the Jews were central to the rise of this great kingdom in Eastern Europe. So initially, the Jews received a very warm welcome. They were merchants, bankers, money changers. They dealt in gold and silver, tax collectors. If I owned a big area in the middle of Russia or Poland, well, I would bring in Jews who would be the tax collectors, who would run it. They had the knowledge, bookkeeping. They knew how to teach people reading and writing. The school would be run by Jewish educators. The hospital would be run by Jewish doctors. The Jews had the connection. So Casimir III, the Great in 1300, invited the Jews to come to his kingdom to make him wealthy. Well, of course, you can imagine if the king was there and had an army, he needed money. So he would order his Jewish workers to go into this little town and collect the taxes, which gradually made the Jews despised and hated, because if the king said, I want a ton of gold from this city, well, the Jews would go in, they would get their ton of gold in whatever way they could, they would give it to the king, and the king would reward them. So the Jews were essential to the rise of the Eastern European countries. They allied themselves with the kings and the emperors, but they gradually were being despised by the people. Well, the Jews, of course, were the preferred people. They lived in the cities, they had the approval of the king, and they were allowed to build their own neighborhoods. Well, they practiced their form of Torah, Orthodox Judaism. They had their scholars. They developed their own language, which was a dialect of German mixed with Hebrew and Polish, written with the Hebrew alphabet. They had their distinctive clothing, their own architecture for their wooden synagogues. They developed their own food, such as the gefilte fish. They had their own music, the klezmer music. They had their own way of pronouncing Hebrew. And so you had the rise of a distinctive Eastern European Jewish civilizations, protected by the kings, encouraged by the kings, and gradually being despised by the majority of the people. So, from positions of teachers, education, generals in the army, government administrators, doctors and hospital workers, engineers and bankers, the Jews in the Holy Roman Empire, the Greek Empire, in Russia, in Poland, in Hungary, the Jews had great power and very strong influence. Well, they developed their own form of Judaism. Once again, Judaism no longer had temples, no longer had priests, and so they were developing what we call Talmudic Judaism. This was a Judaism of studying of the Hebrew Bible. And if you look at a typical page in the Bible, you will see that you have a central text of the Mishnah. Around it was a commentary, interpretation. And so the Judaism became very, very academic, whereas the rabbi was the teacher who knew the Bible, who knew Hebrew, who spent all of his day in intellectual studies. See the famous synagogues of Eastern Europe. This is the synagogue of Krakow in southern Poland. It was a Judaism of study, analyzing. What does this word mean? What does that word mean? What does it mean here? What does the Bible mean it to say? So it became very, very much a study of the Bible, of the Word, very intellectual study. Great rabbis, such as the Gaon of Vilna in the 1700s, Messianic Jews, Shabtai Tzvi, all kinds of different intellectual movements began to flourish in Europe. But it was all intellectual. It was all educational in the brain. It was a religion of study. Well, many of the Jews in Eastern Europe became the famous court Jews. They were the ones who stood behind the kings and the princes and the dukes. They were the ones who borrowed money and lent money. They were the tax collectors. They were the power behind the throne. Very important for keeping the kings on the thrones, but gradually getting more and more despised by the masses of Russians, Lithuanians, and Poles. Many of the Jews by the 18th century pretty well gave up Judaism and became assimilated. They stopped speaking Yiddish and spoke Polish or Hungarian or Russian. They went to regular universities. They dressed like regular people, and they assimilated into society, very often marrying Poles and Hungarians and Russians, like American Jews today. 50% of American Jews are assimilated. They marry Christians and have children who are half Jewish and half Christian. And generally, these children end up just becoming normal, ordinary Americans. Well, this golden age of the Jews in Poland, where they were protected by the kings, they were the doctors, the lawyers, the tax collectors, the administrators, the managers of big estates out in the country. This golden age began to end by the 1700s. Poland, even under the powerful kings with the supports of its Jewish people, ended up losing power. Russia on the east, Germany on the west, and Austria to the south began to carve out sections of Poland, and gradually by 1795, Poland no longer existed. All of the lands had been gobbled up by Russia, Austria, or Germany. These are called the three partitions of Poland. Well, the kings were basically overthrown, driven into exile, but the Jews remained. But they found themselves no longer the tax collectors, no longer the businessmen, the merchants, the dealers in gold and silver and gems. And their status as the preferred people of power gradually began to decline. The Jews became despised not only by the majority of the people, but by the new czars of Russia, emperors of Austria, and emperors of Germany. So they lost power and they lost influence. And this was a major period of crisis for the Jews of Eastern Europe. Once again, they went from a period of power to a period of weakness. Well, what was going to happen to them? Would they disappear? Would they reinvent Judaism to survive? This was the million-dollar question. Again, new conditions demand either adaptation, or if you can't adapt to new conditions, you will disappear and die. Well, of course, many of the Jews said, okay, well, it's time to get rid of all this Judaism stuff. And so they just disappeared and went to Russia, changed their name, and said, we're Russians, or we are Germans, or we are Austrians. Some just became totally secular and moved to the big cities and assimilated. Many decided to leave Eastern Europe and they migrated to the United States, where they settled in the Lower East Side. But it was a period of crisis. Judaism in Eastern Europe could have disappeared from the face of the earth. How were they going to survive? Did they want to survive? Who was going to recreate, reinvent a new kind of Judaism to permit them to survive in this new world? Well, there was a great leader in the early and mid 1700s. He was Rabbi Yisrael ben Eliezer, who took the name Baal Shem Tov. Baal means the owner, Shem means the name, Tov means good. So the author or the possessor of the good name. He set about to invent a new form of Judaism, not a Judaism of the court Jews, where the Jews were generals and tax collectors for the kings, but a kind of Judaism of the ghettos, a Judaism of small towns, a completely new form of Judaism, which would inspire young people to remain Jewish. Well, he said that the rabbi was not just a great educated teacher, but the rabbi was more. A rabbi was the intermediary between God and the people. And in Hasidic Judaism, many rabbis claimed the power to heal the sick. Some even said they could raise the dead. They could perform miracles. Well, some of the great rabbis, the great preaching rabbis of the age, became very, very famous and were considered almost like Jewish saints, great powers, preaching ability, healing the sick, even raising the dead. And they managed to inspire the people, saying, yes, you've lost your privileged position as the enforcers for the kings of Poland and Lithuania. But I have come to tell you a new kind of Judaism, a spiritual Judaism, a Judaism of internal power. And so they had a very, very spiritual religion where, yes, they studied the Torah, but they also had a whole new understanding of God. It was not a religion of money and power and political power under the kings, but it was a direct revelation from God. It was a direct spiritual experience. And the Hasidic rabbis encouraged the people to get emotional. Don't sit and study some dry book all day long, as you see in the picture on the right, but get emotional. Experience God. Let God come into your soul. Scream and yell with excitement. Dance in the streets. Well, of course, those old synagogue rabbis who said, sit and study a book all day is the idea of Judaism. The new Hasid said, well, yes, studying is part of it, but you must experience God in your soul. Dance in the street, cry, scream out loud. It was joyful worship, dancing, singing, clapping. It was not the traditional synagogue of silent worship with your prayer shawl standing in front of the ark and the Torah. Oh no, the Hasidic Jews said, religion should fill your soul. And so gradually a whole new form of Judaism emerged. It was Judaism, where the people wore the beards, the men had the curls and the hats and everything, but it was a lively, it was an exciting, a happy form of Judaism. And so a whole new form of Judaism emerged. And it was a Judaism of emotion, of excitement. Well, central to Hasidic Judaism was the importance of the rabbi. The rabbi was in direct contact with God. And this power of a rabbi was passed on to his sons. And so you had the birth of dynasties where a great rabbi, a great preacher, a great miracle worker would attract thousands of followers, build a synagogue, and his power was passed on to his son. And these great dynasties were located in individual cities. Here we see the synagogue of Belz, which is in Ukraine, dating from 1817. And this was the third Belzer Rebbe on the picture on the right. So it was the grandson of the founder of this dynasty. They were considered saints, and they were very proud to say, I am a follower of the Belzer Rebbe, and I am part of this religious dynasty. Well, this is the beginning of what we call a sectarian religion. Max Weber and Ernst Holz set up the concept of a sect. And a sect was a group that viewed themselves as different from the rest of society. The Hasids, each particular dynasty said, yes, we are Jews, but we are different from all other Jews. We are different from all Christians or Muslims. We are a people apart. We are not part of the larger society. Well, other groups adopted that same sectarian mentality, such as the Amish. They say, yes, we are Christians, like so many Christians, but we are different. We live a life apart. Monasteries, Buddhist monasteries, Christian monasteries, Russian Orthodox monasteries are people who withdraw from society. They consider their style of life superior to all other styles of life. In upstate New York, you had the famous Oneida community, founded by a great religious leader, where the people withdrew from the larger society, established their own way of living in upstate New York. And as Weber said, they were in tension with the larger Christian community. Well, of course, many of the Jews considered the Hasidic Jews as a heresy. They were clearly opposed to it. And so they were in tension with this new religious movement. Well, many different groups emerged, each one thinking that they were unique. For example, we have the Gerer dynasty with the Alter family, going back to the early 1800s, Yitzhak Meir Alter, followed by Yehuda Aryeh Leib Alter, and Alter, going down to the Grand Rabbi Yaakov Aryeh Alter, who was the Grand Rabbi from 1996 to the present. And so the Hasidic Jews divided into rival, often competing dynasty, each one devoted to a particular family or devoted to a particular town. The list on the right, you see the three dynasties from Ukraine and Poland beginning with an A. Then you get to the B dynasties, Romania, Ukraine, Poland, Moldova. Bialystok is one of the very famous groups. Romania, the Bucharesti group. So hundreds of individual dynasties emerged. The Belts are famous, the Buvovs, the Lubovs from Lubavitchers, the Ger, the Karlan, the Sons Klausenberg, the Satmar, very strict Hasidic group, the Skver, the Vishnitz. Hundreds of major and minor dynasties emerged, each one with its own chain of dynastic leaders, each one with their own way of dress, their own traditions, their own belief that they were the superior dynasty. One of the more famous ones is from Ukraine, were the Breslov, founded in the late 1700s. The Munkach in Hungary. Here we see their world headquarters in Borough Park in Brooklyn. Here again, many of them survived the Holocaust, and their survivors migrated largely to Brooklyn. The Satmars, very famous and very strict, founded by the Titelbaum dynasty from Hungary. What distinguished them was they do not support the current secular state of Israel, saying only when the Messiah comes and forbids the Jews of all of their terrible sins will a Jewish state be established, which distinguishes the Satmar dynasty. Dushinsky from Hungary, great dynasty. The Bubovs in Poland also moved to Borough Park in Queens, rallying the survivors of the Holocaust. Well, one of the most famous, and for this class, the most interesting one, were the Lubavitchers, who came from a town of Lubavitch in Russia. And here we see the founder of the Lubavitchers was Shneur Zalman Avliadi, who lived from 1745 to 1811. Well, the family eventually adopted the Schneerson family. And here we see Menachem Mendel Schneerson, who ruled in Lubavitch from 1831 to 1866. Well, he established his own form of Hasidic Judaism. Many of the Lubavitchers also go by the name Chabad, which is, there are many forms of Chabad. Chabad comes from Chokhmah, Bina, and Da'at, which are the three Hebrew words for wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. They were especially noted for their serious academic pursuits, more so than many of the other Hasidic groups in Russia. Yosef Yitzhak Schneerson, 1920-1950, was the sixth of the dynasty. Well, as you can see from the dates, he ruled 1920 to 1950. Well, this was the period of both Adolf Hitler and the Holocaust, and Joseph Stalin and the suppression of religion in the new Soviet Union. Well, the Hasidic Jews of the Lubavitch dynasty were viciously persecuted. Well, following World War II and the Holocaust, a handful were able to escape both the ravages of Hitler and the ravages of communism, and they found their way to Brooklyn. They bought a building, which you see in the picture on the left, at 770 Eastern Parkway in 1940, and that became the refuge of those who had survived. Well, once again, Hasidic Judaism, under both the ravages of Hitler and the ravages of Stalin, Hasidic Judaism could have very easily disappeared or withered away into a tiny group of lost Jews. But the Lubavitchers, when they arrived in the United States, decided that their mission was to salvage Hasidic Judaism in America. In fact, the Hasidic Jews of the Lubavitcher movement considered that the United States was as dangerous as Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia when it came to trying to destroy Judaism. And so they decided that their new mission, a reinvented Lubavitcher Judaism, was to reach out and find the lost Jews of the world. Well, most Jews, the Lubavitchers realized, in America were totally assimilated. They had become Reform or conservative Jews who went to synagogue once in a while, intermarried easily with Christians and other people, went to regular universities, and were gradually disappearing into American society. Groups like the Educational Alliance had been central to the assimilation of the Orthodox Jews of the Lower East Side, leading millions of Jews to completely disappear into American society. So from their Lubavitcher headquarters in Brooklyn, they started reaching out, not only in the United States, but around the world, searching for lost Jews to return them to their original religion. Well, interestingly, the building in Brooklyn was recognized by everybody as the headquarters. So wherever the Lubavitch group established headquarters in any country, whether it was Israel or Australia, they would build a building identical to the one which they had in Brooklyn. So even in Israel, they build their centers as an exact replica of their homeland in Brooklyn. Menachem Mendel Schneerson ruled the dynasty from 1951 to 1994, the seventh in the dynasty. In fact, he was such a charismatic preacher, such a charismatic leader, that he was even proclaimed to be the Messiah by many of his followers. Here again, this is one of these ancient building blocks of all religions, waiting for the arrival of the Messiah. So the Lubavitchers claimed that he was the Messiah, that he would, following his death in 1994, return to life and lead all Jews back to their homeland in Israel and rebuild the Jewish kingdom from the Euphrates River to the Nile, becoming a great empire in the world. He sent out his shluchim, or his emissaries or missionaries, looking for the lost Jews. See the picture with all of his shluchim or his missionaries at a meeting in Brooklyn. The famous mitzvah tanks, you see at the bottom picture and on the right, driving around the cities of the world, going up to people and saying, "Are you Jewish? Return to Judaism." The tank on the right at the bottom, you see Mashiach is coming now, meaning the Messiah is here now. Now, of course, this radical new form of Judaism was viciously condemned by a lot of people, even when Schneerson, who never actually said, "I am the Messiah," but when his followers proclaimed him the Messiah, he never opposed them. And this was considered heresy by many of the Jews. But here again, this was a new radical reinterpretation of Judaism, missionary Judaism, looking for Jews who had stopped practicing Judaism, returning them to the original Judaism of the synagogue. They sent missionaries to the Soviet Union, to Alaska, to Africa, to Hong Kong. Wherever they went, when they'd find Jews, they would establish a Torah school for children, establish yeshivas for training the young people. They would open up kosher butchers. They had Torah instructors for senior citizens, mikvah, the ritual bath, teaching them how to observe the Sabbath and providing them with all of the supplies for the celebration of their religion. And they were acutely aware that America and modern world was a danger. In the Soviet Union, they may kill your body like Hitler did. But in America and the West, they will kill your soul, you'll intermarry, and you'll disappear as a Jew. So their goal was to salvage the Jews of the world. Wonderful book by Sue Fishkoff, The Rebbe's Army. All of these missionaries going around the world looking for lost Jews, returning them to Judaism. Even half Jews would be approached and encouraged to formally convert and become Jewish, encouraging the practice of the customs and the rituals of Orthodox Judaism. Well, the rabbi died in 1994. but many of his followers, as you see in the picture, continue to gather at his tomb, awaiting for his return and his proclamation as the actual Messiah. Once again, this is a new form of Judaism, highly criticized by many other Jews because of its Messiah teaching and its loyalty to a rabbi, a dynasty, but yet it has exerted great power in the Jewish community and really salvaged a lot of lost Jews and is a very rapidly growing religious movement. Well, the Hasidic Jews today remain powerful. Just like there were the great dynasties of Eastern Europe, so even in America, there are new dynasties. You have the Bostoner Hasids, founded after World War II. The Clevelander Hasids, founded between the wars and especially after World War II. These are new Hasidic movements, which are once again becoming very powerful in American Jewish society. The Hasids have attracted some considerable curiosity. The famous film and Broadway show, Fiddler on the Roof. Movies like Menashe, portraying the life of the Orthodox Jews in Brooklyn. So they have attracted an audience far beyond the Orthodox or Hasidic community. Movie Holy Rollers, Black Hats, once again exploring the life of the Hasidic Jews, who are rapidly becoming one of the largest Jewish communities in the United States, well organized, well financed, and well inspired. Of course, not all of the portrayals of the Orthodox and the Hasidic Jews have been positive. See books called and films Unorthodox, The Scandalous Rejection of My Hasidic Roots by Netflix. Other books, The New Hasidim, once again, reinterpreting Eastern European and American Hasidism and forming even new types of Hasidism. With the collapse of the Iron Curtain and the collapse of the Soviet Union, many of the Hasids have started a tradition of pilgrimage, going back to the place where they were founded in Poland, in the Ukraine, in Russia, rebuilding synagogues going back to the 1700s. And this has become a very attractive way for a lot of the young Hasidic Jews to identify with the new movement, sort of a rediscovery of the power of pilgrimage. Now, many of the Hasidic Jews have an ambivalent relationship with the state of Israel. Most Reform Jews try to balance loyalty to the United States with loyalty to the state of Israel. You can be loyal to two countries. Well, the Hasidic Jews don't have any flags in their synagogues. They're not loyal to the state of Israel. They're not loyal to the United States. Their number one loyalty is to Judaism. and they are awaiting the return of the Messiah, who will then decide that the time is appropriate for all the Jews to return to the land of Israel. So they have a rather ambivalent attitude towards the state of Israel, which they consider a secular, many of them even consider it a heretical state that should not be supported by Jews. So this is, the Lubavitchers and the Hasidic Jews is a fascinating chapter in how religions have to adjust, how they have to adapt to new circumstances or they die. And we're seeing this more and more in the world today. Time magazine had the face of Buddhist terrorism, where the Buddhists are beginning to reinterpret Buddhism, not as a religion of peace and love, but as religion to establish Buddhist empires in the world. In the United States, under Donald Trump, you had the reinterpretation of Christianity to evangelical Christianity, where the end of the world was approaching. In Israel, you have the new secular Zionism of Israelis going out into the West Bank and building settlements, a new form of militaristic Judaism. So in this world of today, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, religions are changing. It's not your old religion of a long time ago. And if religions don't change and don't adapt, they will end up in the garbage can of history. And so the Lubavitchers and the Hasidic Jews are part of this radical reinterpretation of Judaism to make Judaism relevant to the modern world, to inspire young people, and to create a new world. So once again, this is Dr. Ronald Brown, thanking you for joining me for this very exciting lecture on one of the most interesting Jewish developments of the last several years. And I hope to see you in the future for another exciting lecture on religion in the modern world. Thank you once again for joining me, and I hope to see you again soon.